Morning, fourth graders. I'm back with the last installment of Owls in the Family. So we will finish the book today. Chapter 9. Wall and Weeps were with us long enough to be well known in Saskatoon, particularly Wall. As my father said, Wall never quite realized he was an owl. Most of the time he seemed to think he was people. At any rate, he liked being with people, and he wanted to be with us so much that we finally had to stop trying to keep him out of the house. If we locked him out, he would come and bang his big beak against the window panes so hard we were afraid the glass would break. Screens were no good either, because he would tear them open with one sweep of his big claws. So eventually he became a house owl. He was always very well mannered, except in the house. He was always very well mannered in the house, and he caused no trouble, except on one particular occasion. One midsummer day, we had a visit from the new minister of our church. He had just arrived in Saskatoon, so he didn't know about our owls. Mother took him into the living room, and he sat down on our sofa with a cup of tea balanced on his knee, and began to talk to Mother about me skipping Sunday school. Wall had been off on an expedition down on the riverbank. When he got home, he ambled across the lawn, jumped up to the ledge of one of the living room windows, and peered in. Spotting the stranger, he gave another leap and landed heavily on the minister's shoulder. Mother had seen him coming and had tried to warn the minister, but she was too late. By the time she had her mouth open, Wall was already hunched down on the man's shoulder, peering around into his face, making friendly owl noises. "Hoo-hoo," he asked politely. And here's a picture of it. Instead of answering, the minister let out a startled yelp and sprang to his feet. The tea spilled all over the rug, and the teacup shot into the fireplace and smashed into a million pieces. It was all so sudden that Wall lost his balance, and when he lost his balance, his talons just naturally tightened up to help him steady himself. When Wall tightened his grip, the minister gave a wild Indian yell and made a dash for the door. Wall had never been treated this way before. He didn't like it. Just as the minister reached the front porch, Wall spread his wings and took off. His wings were big, and they were strong, too. One of them clipped the man a bang on the side of his head, making him yell even louder. But by then, Wall was airborne. He flew up into his favorite poplar tree, and he was in such a huff at the way he had been treated that he wouldn't come down again till supper. Riding on people's shoulders was a favorite pastime with Wall. Usually he was so careful with his big claws that you couldn't even feel them. Sometimes when he was on your shoulder and feeling especially friendly, he would nibble your ear. His beak was sharp enough to have taken the ear right off your head at a single bite, but he would just catch the bottom of your ear in his beak and very gently nibble it a little. It didn't hurt at all, though it used to make some people nervous. One of my father's friends was a man who worked for the railroad, and he had very big red ears. Every time he came for a visit to our house, he wore a cap with ear flaps. He wore it even in summertime because he said, with ears as big as his and an ear-nibbling owl around, he just couldn't afford to take any chances. Wall was usually good-natured, but he could get mad. One morning, Mother sent me to the store for some groceries. My bike had a flat tire, so I had to walk, and Wall walked with me. We were only a little way from our house when we met the postman coming toward us. He had a big bundle of letters in his hand, and he was sorting them and not watching where he was going. And instead of stepping around Wall, he walked right into him. And here's a picture of that. Worse still, he didn't even look down to see what it was he had stumbled over. He just gave a kind of kick to get whatever it was out of his way. Well, you could do a lot of things to Wall and get away with it, but kicking him was something different. Hissing like a giant tea kettle, he spread his wings wide out and clomped the postman on the shins with them. A whack from one of his wings was like the kick of a mule. Postman dropped his handful of letters and went pelting down the street yelling "Blue Murder," with Wall right on his heels. After I got hold of Wall and calmed him down, I apologized to the postman. But for a month after that, he wouldn't come into our yard at all. He used to stand at the gate and whistle until one of us came out to get the mail. Our owls were so used to going nearly everywhere with me now that when school started that fall, I had a hard time keeping them at home. I used to bicycle to school, which was about 2 miles away across the river. During the first week after school opened, I was late 4 times because of having to take the owls back home after they had followed me part way. Finally, Dad suggested that I lock them up in the big pen each morning just before I left. Wall and Weeps hadn't used that pen for a long time, and when I put them in, they acted as if it was a jail. Wall was particularly furious, and he began to tear at the chicken wire with his beak and claws. I sneaked off fast. I was almost late anyway, and I knew if I was late once more, I'd be kept in after school. I was about halfway over the river bridge when a man on the footpath gave a shout and pointed to something behind my back. At the same time, a car coming toward me jammed on its brakes and nearly skidded into the cement railings. Not knowing what was going on, I put on my brakes too, and I just had time to stop when there was a wild rush of air on the back of my neck, a deep hoo, hoo, hoo in my ear, and Wall landed on my shoulder. He was out of breath, but he was so pleased with himself that I didn't have the heart to take him home. Anyway, there wasn't time, so he rode the handlebars the rest of the way to school. I skidded into the yard just as the 2-minute bell was ringing, and all the other kids were going through the doors. Couldn't decide what on earth to do with Wall. Then I remembered that I had some twine in my pocket. I fished it out and used it to tie him by one leg to the handlebars. The first class I had that morning was French. Well, between worrying about Wall and not having done my homework, I was soon in trouble with the teacher, whom we called Fifi behind her back. Fifi made me come up in front of the class so she could tell me how dumb I was. I was standing beside her desk wishing the floor would open up and swallow me when there was a whoomp, whoomp, whoomp at the window. I turned my head to look, and there sat Wall. It hadn't taken him long to untie the twine. I heard later he had banged on the windows of 2 or 3 other classrooms before he found the right one. Having found the right room at last, he didn't waste any time. Unluckily, Fifi had left one of our windows open. Wall ducked down, saw me, flew right in. He was probably aiming to land on my shoulder, but he missed, and at the last second tried to land on Fifi's desk. It was a polished hardwood desk. He couldn't get a grip on it. His brakes just wouldn't hold. He skated straight across the desk, scattering papers and books all over the floor. Fifi saw him coming and tried to get up out of her chair, but she wasn't fast enough. Wall skidded off the end of the desk and plumped right into her lap. There were some ructions after that. I was sent to the principal's office, and Fifi went home for the rest of the day. The principal was a good fellow, though. He just read me a lecture and warned me that if I didn't keep my owl away from the school in the future, he would have to get the police to do something about it. We finally figured out a way to keep the owls from following me to school. Each morning, just before I left, we would let Wall and Weeps into the kitchen. Mother would feed them the bacon rinds left over from breakfast, while I sneaked out the front door and rode away. It worked fine, but it was a little hard on Mother because the owls got so fond of the kitchen, she usually couldn't get them out of it again. Once I heard her telling a friend that until a woman had tried to bake a cake with 2 horned owls looking over her shoulders, well, she hadn't really lived at all. Chapter 10. 30 miles south of Saskatoon, there was a little village called Dundurn. It consisted of a garage, a couple of houses, and 2 red wooden grain elevators. Between Dundurn and the Saskatchewan River was a huge expanse of virgin prairie, and right in the middle of it was a slough that was so big it was almost a real lake, even though the water wasn't very deep. This lake was about the best place for ducks and geese and other water birds in the whole of Saskatchewan. The reed beds along its shore were full of yellow-headed blackbirds, bitterns, coots, and grebes. Out on the open water, you could sometimes see 200 or 300 families of ducks, mallards, pintails, shovelers, and lots of other kinds. Sometimes there were flocks of whistling swans, and in the autumn, so many geese stopped to rest that they almost hid the water. Every summer, we used to camp for a couple of weeks near Dundurn in a four-wheeled caravan my father had built, which we used to tow behind our Model A Ford. The caravan was fixed up like a little ship. It had ship's bunks, ship's galley, which is what sailors call a kitchen, ship's lamps, and a ship's clock. On deck, the roof, there was even a little mast with a flag flying from it. People in Saskatoon used to call it Moat's Prairie Schooner. On a stormy night when the wind made the caravan rock back and forth, you could lie snug in your bunk and find it hard to believe you weren't on a real schooner after all. Of course, whenever we took the caravan on a trip, Mutt and the Owls had to come along. Our Ford was a convertible with a rumble seat. A rumble seat, something cars don't have anymore, was a sort of folding seat placed where the trunk is on a modern car. This was where Mutt, the Owls, my friends, and I used to ride. Mutt always rode with his head and front feet stuck way out over the side of the car, while Bruce or I held onto his tail so he wouldn't fall out on his nose. The Owls used to perch on the back of the rumble seat, and they had to hang on for dear life. Because his eyes used to get sore from the dust of the prairie roads, Mutt had to wear goggles, same kind that motorcycle riders wear. The sight of a goggled dog, two horned owls in our prairie schooner used to make people in other cars take a long look as they went by. Sometimes they didn't believe their eyes, and then they would turn their cars around and follow us to make sure they hadn't been seeing things. During the second summer that the Owls lived with us, we went to Dundurn for a camping trip. There was lots of water in the lake that year, and my father brought along his canoe tied to the deck of the caravan. He paddled Bruce and me all around the lake looking at birds. We must have found 100 ducks' nests, and we even found the huge nest of a sandhill crane. The first few times we went out in the canoe, Wall came down to the shore to see us off, but he wouldn't come canoeing with us. I think he still remembered the trouble he'd had with the Saskatchewan River at the cave, and he didn't trust water anymore. All the same, he hated to be left out of things. But when Weeps made up his mind to join us in the canoe one day, Wall got up his nerve and decided he'd come too. It wasn't a very big canoe, and by the time 2 boys, 1 man, 2 owls, and a dog had climbed in, it was pretty crowded, pretty low in the water. We had to sit as still as mummies. For a while, Dad paddled in the open lake, and then we began to explore the reed beds. Soon we came to a muskrat's house with the nest of a mallard duck built on top of it. We had a look into the nest and were wondering how long it would be until the eggs hatched out, when a crow came swooping over the marsh. He caught the sight of our 2 owls and just about went crazy. He cawed and cawed until, in about 5 minutes, the sky was black with crows. The more that came, the braver they all got. And soon they were diving down within a couple of feet of our heads. Dad tried to scare them away by waving his paddle and shouting, but by this time they were so excited they paid no attention to us. I guess no crows had ever caught a pair of owls at such a disadvantage before, and they were going to make the most of it. Weeps scuttled under my seat and hid between my legs. But Wall, who was perched on the bow of the canoe, wasn't going to run away. He kept getting madder and madder until he was hissing and clacking his beak in a perfect fury. This made the crows even more excited, and some of them dived so close that the wind ruffled Wall's feathers. Finally, 1 crow came a little bit too close. Suddenly, Wall spread his wings and jumped into the air, and at the same time, he gave a sort of half-turn on his side and grabbed at the crow with both sets of talons. There was an explosion of black feathers, and the crow went squawking off across the marsh half naked. Now here you can see them. are in the canoe. Whoops. There we go. We didn't have time to watch him go. When Wall jumped, Bruce tried to catch him for fear he would fall in the water and be drowned, and that did it. Next second, all of us, except Wall, were in the lake. The water was only up to our knees, but the lake bottom was slimy black muck. As we scrambled to get hold of the canoe, Bruce and I and Dad got coated from head to foot with slime. Mutt, who had more sense than any of us, abandoned the canoe and headed for the muskrat house. Weeps, who must have thought this was the end, somehow managed to clutch hold of Mutt's tail and was towed to the muskrat house. Wall, who had been flying when the canoe upset and who now couldn't find any place to land, kept circling over our heads, hooting at us to help him down. The crows were going wild. All the ducks and geese in the marsh were excited too, and now they started to quack and honk until there was such a row you couldn't have heard a cannon being fired. It took us nearly an hour to get back to shore. Dad pushed Bruce and me into the flooded canoe. Then he waded ahead, towing us. On the way, we stopped at the muskrat house and rescued Mutt and Weeps. Wall finally grew so tired that he had to land somewhere, and he flopped down on my father's head. This accident made us so angry with crows, any crows, that we could cheerfully have wrung the neck of every crow in Saskatchewan. The next morning, Dad got out his shotgun and swore he was going to even up the score. He decided he would hide at the edge of a bluff near the lake, where the crows used to gather, and try to call them into range of his gun with a wooden crow call. Bruce and I and Wall went with him, but we stayed out of sight in the middle of the bluff while Dad tried to get the black devils, as he called them, to come close enough to be shot. But crows are wise birds in some ways. They can recognize a gun a long way off, and some of them must have spotted Dad's shotgun. He blew and blew on his crow call, but though there were lots of them around, they all stayed a healthy distance away. Eventually, Wall got bored, and the first thing I knew, he had walked right out into the open and climbed up on a fence post. The crow call hadn't worked, but Wall sure did. As soon as they saw him, the crows forgot all about being cautious and about my father's gun. They gathered in clouds and began diving at Wall. Dad couldn't miss. His shotgun was banging so steadily it began to sound as if a war had started. After each shot, the surviving crows would climb out of range. Then Wall would begin flapping his wings and hooting insults at them, and they would forget about the gun again. The war with the crows lasted until Dad was out of ammunition. But by then, there were a lot fewer crows around Dundurn. When we got back to camp, I was telling Mother about it, beginning with the way Wall had accidentally wandered out into the open. Wandered out? My father interrupted. Don't you believe that? Wall knew exactly what he was doing. And come to think of it, Dad was probably right. And here's a picture. And that brings us to the final chapter in this book. Oh, darn it. Chapter 11. The spring when Weeps and Wall became 3 years old was a very sad spring for me. My father had taken a new job, and so we had to leave Saskatoon and go east to the big Ontario city of Toronto. There would be no more sloughs, no gophers, no bluffs, and worst of all, no prairies in Toronto. I hated the idea of moving, but most of all, I hated leaving my friends behind, both my human and my animal friends. We couldn't take Weeps and Wall because they would have had to spend all their days locked up in a cage, and that would have been cruel. On the other hand, we couldn't just turn them loose either, because they had been members of a human family for so long that they wouldn't have been able to look out for themselves. All we could do was try to find someone who would give them a new home. I talked to most of my chums about this, and they all said they were willing to take my owls, but their parents wouldn't hear of it. Then one day I thought about Bruce. He and his family had moved away from Saskatoon a while earlier and were running a fox farm about 200 miles to the northwest. I sat down and wrote Bruce a letter, and a few days later I got his reply. Dear Billy, it is pretty good here. There are lots of ducks, and we have started the fox farm and got lots of fox pups. Dad says sure I can have the owls. We have an old fox pen I'm fixing up to keep them, and I am building a wood house in it to keep them warm. Rex is healthy and says hello to Mutt and says, bring Mutt up here for a visit when you come with the owls. There's a lot of Indians here, and I go to school with a lot of real Indian kids. When you come, I will take you there and you can ride some of their horses. So long, your old pal, Bruce. I showed the letter to my father. Sounds fine, Billy, he said. What do you say we drive up to Bruce's place on Friday afternoon and stay over for a visit until Sunday night? Excuse me, just a second. I said yes, of course, and that was what we did. It was a wonderful trip to Bruce's. Sloughs were full of water, and the water was covered with ducks resting on their way north. We saw prairie chickens dancing on the side of the road, and there were more meadowlarks and red-tailed hawks than you could shake a stick at. The owls rode with me and Mutt in the rumble seat, and they had a wonderful time. When we got to the farm, Bruce's mother had a big feed ready for us. On Saturday, Bruce took me to the Indian reservation to meet his pals. One of them, a boy about my age named Harry Wildhawk, loaned me a cayuse. And here they are. Well, there we go. And the three of us rode all over the old prairie that day, chasing coyotes and jackrabbits on horseback. On Sunday, Bruce and I stayed around the farm, and I helped him finish off the cage where Wall and Weeps would sleep at night. That was a sad business. And I kept wishing that Saturday could have gone on forever. Wall and Weeps didn't seem to suspect anything. I think they were having too much fun to be suspicious. Wall went off and explored the big poplar bluffs behind the fox farm. And then he walked all around among the fox cages, hooting at the foxes and daring them to start something. Weeps found his way to the meat house where the fox food was ground up in big mincing machine, and the hired man fed Weeps so many scraps that he could hardly walk at all. Sunday night, we put the two owls in their new cage. Weeps was asleep almost before I could turn the catch on the door. But all of a sudden, Wall seemed to sense that something was wrong. He gave a funny sort of hoot, then he jumped over to the door and put his head against the wire mesh. I reached down and tickled him behind his horns for a minute, and he seemed to think things were all right again. He climbed back up to his perch and fluffed out his feathers for the night. I said, "Goodbye, old owls. Look after each other. Someday, maybe, I'll be back." And then the book ends with this, which is a note from the author, and his name is Farley Mowat, who says, "Were Wall and Weeps real owls? Well, of course they were. And Mutt and Rex and Murray and Bruce and I were real. And if you should happen to be going to Saskatoon in the spring of the year, and if you should happen to take a walk across the prairie, why, it wouldn't surprise me in the least if you happen to meet some of us. And if it's a big white owl and a not so big brown owl you meet, give them my love, will you?" And that's the end of the book. I hope you enjoyed that. Owls in the Family by Farley Mowat. Okay, then. I probably will read to you at least once more. And I haven't quite decided yet how we're doing this. I have to check with your teachers. But I will spend one day just reading our favorite poems together. So at any rate, I hope you're having a good week and enjoying the sunshine. And I'll be back again soon. Goodbye.